So are we ready to start? Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning to you all. Welcome to this panel. This home was Catholic Protestantism and Community Violence and State Formation in Modern Mexico, sponsored by the Latin American and Caribbean section of the conference. It's a pleasure to welcome my fellow panelists, Kathleen McIntyre, Madeleine Olsen, Ben Fallaw, who I hope will be joining us very shortly. And of course, our esteemed commentator, Jason Dromedy, who will wrap up the session. So our panel is named after the signs that used to appear and still do appear in many homes in Mexico, advising people that the occupants therein are Catholic and do not welcome propaganda from other sects, is how the slogan goes. Our panel is especially interested in those other sects and in finding out what happened and what became of those people who were religious dissidents in a Catholic country during the 20th century. My name is Matthew Butler. I'm the chair of the panel, and I'm also going first. So I shall get underway in a second, and then I will introduce the remainder of our panel as we go. So my paper is called Crypto-Protestantism in Mexico's Totonacapan, the Mexican Catholic and Apostolic Church. And I depart from the assumption that if Mexico is Catholic, it's not one and Catholic. In fact, Mexico's modern history is littered with experimental nation, state, or ethnic-centered Catholicism that have periodically offered alternatives to Roman Catholicism. And by the same token, it's often been alleged that dissident, i.e. non-Roman Catholics, are in fact crypto-Protestants, religious dissemblers, purveyors of a gateway religion. That charge was made especially during the Mexican Revolution in relation to Father Joaquin Perez, a wizened Oaxacan priest who in 1925 launched the so-called Mexican Catholic and Apostolic Church, the Iglesia Católica Apostólica Mexicana in Mexico City. The movement was front page news for a time, and its notorious semi-official character was a decided driver in the polarization in Mexico that led to the Cristero War in 1926 from 1929. Nonetheless, a black legend of Perez has emerged very, very quickly, in which Roman Catholics in Mexico especially talked of him as a hawker of Protestant Bibles in Puebla and Veracruz. They claimed he used an alias of Padre Palma. They claimed he was awash with Yankee Protestant gold. And really his movement was filled with religious fakers. They were using a Catholic protest to lure people into a Protestant religion. Protestants themselves, in many ways, contributed to this view that Reform/liberal Catholicisms in Mexico are, the first step towards Protestant affiliation in Mexico. One example: Herbert Pickens Gambrell, who was a young Texan Baptist and a Southern Methodist University history professor, went to Mexico in 1925 to investigate Perez's movement, the ICAM. Yet when he met Perez in his cathedral on the Avenida Juarez, all he could really admire was the whitewashed decor, the Protestant feel of the place, and a shared dislike of the political might of Roman Catholicism in Mexico. Other than that, Gambrell was distressed to see that Perez retained the Catholic Mass, that he retained vestiges of Guadalupanismo, and that he even delved into alternative religions, Spiritism, Freemasonry. Circumstances, Gambrell wrote, would seem to call for an entente cordiale with Protestant forces, but not so. What's more surprising, perhaps, is that some modern historians still reproduce the teleological assumptions of contemporary polemicists, that dissident offshoots of Catholicism were mere stepping stones on the way to a fully reformed Protestant religion. I refer especially to Jean-Pierre Bastien, for example, whose history of Mexican Protestantism is grounded in a prehistory of liberal Catholic experimentation. Yet nonetheless, Bastien insists that Protestants, as the Mexican religious dissidents, only found a full kind of modern religious affiliation in full-bore Protestantisms once they'd migrated through those kinds of liberal Catholic institutions. I think there's a problem with that analysis. It reproduces the saviorism of Protestant mishkids. It misrepresents liberal Catholic viewpoints in Mexico. And I think what perhaps most seriously, it misrepresents the way that Protestantism really has functioned in Mexico, and especially in rural and indigenous Mexico. As my fellow panelist, Kathleen McIntyre, writes in her excellent book on Mexican Protestantism in Oaxaca, usually it was struggles over indigenous labor practices, festive culture, communal authority, a desire to navigate between Roman Catholic and revolutionary officialdoms that drove experimentation in Protestantism, rather than this kind of modernizing drive that Bastien talks about. And Kathleen's book is filled with a wonderful kind of long durée history of this in Oaxaca. I think these more rooted accounts of Mexico's evangelical turn suggest a much better way to understand liberal Catholic experiments in Mexico as well, such as Father Perez's, not as failed bids for modernity, but as alternative social and religious projects mixing indigeneity with Catholicism, revolutionary participation, and the like. What we see happening frequently in the 1920s, and I should be talking really about the 1920s, especially during the Cristero War, is a kind of shadow or counter-Cristiada, in which indigenous communities leverage the constitutionalism of the Mexican Revolution in order to redefine the relationship between indigeneity, Catholicism, the church, and the state. They were protesting, but they were not necessarily Protestants, in other words. I start from an empirical investigation and the discovery that Perez's movement, which we tend to associate with Mexico City and the battle at the Church of La Soledad in 1925, was in reality a fundamentally rural and indigenous movement. It had several hundred indigenous parishes and vicarias under its sway in Puebla, Veracruz, Hidalgo, Chiapas, Oaxaca, southern central indigenous Mexico fundamentally. So the idea that Perez is just a kind of religious provocateur or a Protestant stooge really doesn't stand up in terms of the ideological geography of the movement. I think we also need to understand the trigger mechanism for religious hostilities in 1920s Mexico in a different way as well. And here I'm really referring to the 1926 Calles Law, which enforced all of the 1917 Constitution's restrictions on the practice of public religion, and is usually seen as a trigger for the Cristero War and as an unreconstructed piece of clarophobia. It's important to understand, however, that the Calles Law didn't just require priests to submit to the state in terms of registration. It required priests to register as occupants of specific church buildings, or what were called temporalities. Priests had to register as occupants of a church, and they needed a civilian quorum of the community in question in order to do so. They needed to be voted in by local people, in other words. So the real aim of the Calles Law for many people was that or the real purpose or the real value of the Calles Law was that it created a constitutional, lay-governed church that bypassed the ecclesiastical hierarchy and the structure of curas, bishops and archbishops and so forth. Civilian juntas could hire and fire their own priests for perhaps the first time in Mexican history. And we discover that many indigenous people during the 1920s choose to do just this. Normally they have one of two motives, it seemed to me. One clearly religious and the other perhaps more political, though associated with religion. First, we have to remember that during the Cristero War, public worship was suspended in Mexico by the Roman Catholic clergy. So moving sideways into a parallel Catholic church allows for the resumption of religious festivals and fiestas, the resumption of pilgrimage and commerce, the celebration of agrarian rights, which people call costumbre, and also accumulated prestige for indigenous elites who were feeling the pressure from mestizo Roman Catholic clerics and often new farmer grower interest in their communities. That perhaps is why we find these communities that support Perez in the Sierra de Puebla, in the Totonacapan, the region that crosses Puebla and Veracruz, and points more southerly than that. Second, in returning to the point about indigenous elites, by creating a kind of Catholic denominationalism, Perez created religious differences that could be mapped onto other kinds of conflicts. And I think that's a really important factor for understanding why his movement had success. I refer to things such as jurisdictional disputes between satellite pueblos and parish seats or cabeceras. Often there's competition between the vicaria, which wants to become a parroquia, and so in order to do this, they import a Mexican Catholic priest and begin to dialogue with the Mexican state through that reason. Often there was a kind of popular Catholic anti-clericalism. Perez's clergy undercut Roman Catholic priests. They charged less for their misses and for their sacraments, and so there were economic motives for people to enter into them. And then there were ethnic struggles between groups that people called de razón, the mestizo elites often in the municipal and parish seats, and indigenous people in other parts of local society. So really we're seeing a contest over the parameters and the terms of local religion and the capacity to mediate that, whether that should be within the hands of the Roman Catholic clergy anymore or within a dissident clergy with a much stronger relationship with the Mexican post-revolutionary state. Supernatural favor, territory, political power, civil ecclesiastical autonomy. These are the elements of struggles that begin in the 1920s and often roll out through the 1930s and in some places to way beyond. Time will only permit me to give you one or two examples of this pattern. I think a very good example, we can find it in the Puebla Tlaxcala Valley, southeast of Mexico City. In two pueblos, Ywcas and Actipan, where we find that Mexican Catholic affiliation respected widespread feelings of religious and economic insecurity originating in the suspension of public worship, and especially the prospect of cancelled fiestas, which would dishonor the community's relationship with its patron saints and have unpredictable ontological and agricultural consequences. We also find very clearly that Mexican indigenous people viewed the suspension of religious worship in very different colors to mestizo campesinos in the Bajío and to obviously the Mexican Roman Catholic clergy. For them, it wasn't a Eucharistic problem in the way that it was elsewhere. It was a restriction that prevented the celebration of public religion, especially saint-based religion. And this was something they were keen to have back, regardless of whether the Roman Catholic clergy was willing to do so as well. And so we find that contrary to the assumption that Perez's movement was always greeted with stone throwing and lynchings, we find scenes such as this. I'll describe the arrival of a Mexican Catholic priest in the town of Actipan in 1929 during the Cristero War, and he says that I never thought that they would prepare such a reception for me as the one they gave, for I do not deserve it. Peals of bells, confetti, the throwing of flowers wherever I walked, in sum an overflowing of happiness, and all, as I say, unmerited, for on the inside I took pity on these people. For now I do not complain of all the attentions that they give me, since I seem like a count from the time of the viceroys, with stirrup attendants, domestics, waiters, and servants who desire to anticipate my every wish. So for now I'm on my insula, and the insula is the island. It's the island in Don Quixote where Sancho Panza becomes the religious governor for a time. So there's a hint of the unusual and the kind of autonomous things that we find here. When we go beneath the initial festive jubilation, we find very often that there are these kinds of underlying ethnic and factional political conflicts in these communities. Here, for example, we find that the dissident church was led by a man called Pedro Cancino, who was waging war simultaneously against mestizo religious officials and mestizo municipal officials. And he talks repeatedly in his correspondence with Father Perez about the so-called people of razón, the so-called people of reason. He's denouncing again and again these kind of mestizo groups who are interfering in the life of the pueblo and making his life impossible. So often we find that Perez's movement falls into this bracket of kind of conservative religious resistance by indigenous patriarchs, indigenous mayordomos, fiesta chiefs, village chieftains and clans. These are the people who are fighting a rearguard action against certain kinds of economic and religious modernization and using the power of the Mexican revolutionary state and its proxy church in order to do so. I'll give you one more example before I close and hand over to my fellow panelists. This will be the community of Cuyucuenda in Veracruz, where we find a battle between Afro-Indigenous campesinos and a local cacique, Alberto Paez, breaking out. The Cuyucuenda is a hacienda community surrounded by indigenous mulatto pueblos on the Veracruz leeward, the Sotavento, the inland area around Veracruz. It's named actually Cuyucuenda from the Angolan for plantation I have noted down somewhere. And this is a kind of novel variation on the theme of client hacienda villages seeking right-of-way and grazing rights on an estate, perhaps seeking parish status, and engaging with Father Perez's movement in order to gain access to a shrine that was located on the Cuyucuenda properties, but that they were prevented from visiting because of the Roman Catholic religious strike and the opposition of the landlord Alberto Paez. So we start to find that petitions arrive on Perez's door for the sending of Mexican Catholic priests, and that they wish to celebrate devotion to the so-called Virgen de la O, the Virgin of the O. That was because of the embouchure of the choirs and the cofrades that used to sing her praises by all accounts. So again, it's an example of ethnic stroke local stroke autonomist religious dissidence and protest against Roman Catholicism, but clearly it's not theological Protestantism. It is a kind of religious revolutionary take on Catholicism. And we find various cases of this on the Veracruz leeward, dozens of them in fact. So in conclusion, independent Catholicisms have emerged in Mexico at the intersection as a result of the tensions arising between indigenous religious cultures, church-state conflicts, ecclesiastical reforms, and secular nation-building projects. Because of these competing pressures, Catholic independents have usually been dissenters and sometimes cultural conservatives. No matter how controversial or minoritarian, however, independent Catholicism such as Perez provide a long thread of continuity in Mexican religious history, one that we tend to ignore. There have even been brief periods in the 1920s and 1930s, for instance, in which independent Catholics have provided not only an intriguing counter-narrative to official Catholicism, but a direct challenge and even an effort to establish themselves as dominant local institutions in their own right and as more effective mediators between local religion and the Mexican bureaucracy. So thank you very much. I will now put my chair hat on again and introduce our next speaker, who is indeed Kathleen McIntyre of the University of Rhode Island. Kathleen is Associate Director of URI's Honours Programme, Assistant Professor of Gender and Women's Studies. She specialises in religion, Indigenous peoples and gender in modern Mexico. Her book, Protestantism and State Formation in Post-Revolutionary Oaxaca, examines religious conflict and traditional governance in native communities. And she has many honours and achievements, an NEH award I see here, and she is currently writing a book project called Protestant Women and Political Activism in Mexico, 1900 to 1955. So adelante, Kathleen, very welcome.
All right, thank you. Buenas tardes. I'm here in Rhode Island, so it is late afternoon. Can everyone see my slideshow okay? Good, okay, great. I will go ahead and get started. In September of 1921, Protestants from all over the nation organized a velada in Mexico City's Teatro Iris, making it the largest mass gathering of Protestants in Mexico's history. The lectures, performances, dances celebrated the centennial of Mexico's War of Independence. Intent on breaking away from the Catholic symbols traditionally associated with the independence wars, Protestants held national and regional celebrations, writing themselves into the political narrative by highlighting how they were the ones who were inseparable from the triumph of the recent 1910 Mexican Revolution. Beginning in the 20s, post-revolutionary governments sought to limit the power of the church in education, among other areas. President Obregón sought to unify Mexican citizens through an emphasis on civic education, especially through rural schools. As historian Ruben Ruiz Guerra notes, in many rural communities during the Porfiriato, Protestant schools sometimes were the only schools. Pastor teachers brought literacy to poor regions and also included girls and women in their programming, hoping that, quote, women would carry books instead of rosary beads, end quote. These same Protestant teachers now eagerly applied to leadership positions in the newly formed Secretaría de Educación Pública, SEP, and were determined to show how Protestant schools back the tenets of the revolution, celebrating its heroes just like the public schools now did. From their emphasis on patriotic holidays, support for women's suffrage, sports programming, and close ties to SEP, Methodist schools closely align their mission with post-revolutionary nationalist and anti-clerical goals. Through the lens of Methodist education, my paper today examines the intersection of transnational suffrage, sports, revolutionary nationalism, and new debates about the role of Protestantism in Mexico. Methodist girls' schools, many of them founded in the 1870s, 1880s, became successful mobilizing structures for women's rights. They also closely followed government indigenista policies from the Obregón administration through the Cardenista sexenio. My paper today is just going to focus on three schools: the Normal Metodista de Señoritas in Puebla, Hijas de Allende in Pachuca, Hidalgo, and Colegio Juárez in Guanajuato. Just a couple of pictures there. It's the Puebla school. All right. So to celebrate the centennial, Puebla's Instituto Normal Metodista de Señoritas organized a huge conference discussing women's position in society. The renowned teaching certification school wanted to highlight the role its own graduates, teachers, missionaries, and ministers played in supporting women's rights. The 1921 conference had a record number of participants. Recent graduates, for example, Concha Perez, a deaconess, discussed women's contributions to Methodist pastoral initiatives. Concepcion Hernandez, a nurse, lectured on proper childcare. Panels also addressed salubrious living conditions, suffrage, and temperance. One of the keynote speakers, Epimenio Velasco, pastor of Santísima Trinidad Church in Mexico City, laid out the major inequalities and deplorable social problems facing Mexico in the 20s. Clara Hill, she's a missionary who I'm writing about right now, so you'll hear me referring to her a bit. She was a teacher at Hijas de Allende, and she was part of one of the panels about women's position in society. She gave a speech about suffrage, and she's an interesting person to look at because she was very active in the National Women's Party in the US. Her younger sister actually was one of the top leaders in the National Women's Party, and Clara Hill spent a lot of time even after she left Mexico in 1931, participating in transnational suffrage and women's rights organizations. Okay. So Clara Hill, after she gave her speech about suffrage, she wrote home that she, quote, rather trembled, end quote, that Pastor Velasco's presentation might, quote, knock all of my work down on suffrage, but to my delight, he cinched every nail I had driven, end quote. In fact, she wrote, Velasco did not neglect the side of justice to women. Hill took justice to mean suffrage, as well as educational and labor opportunities. So again, Hill, she was from this political family in Connecticut. She had taught at Methodist schools in Mexico for over a decade. And she was active, as I mentioned, in the National Women's Party, World Women's Party, and throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s in equal rights amendment legislation or the attempts for it in the US. So as soon as she voted in her first federal election in the United States in fall of 20, she headed to Mexico in 1921 through the Women's Foreign Missionary, Methodist Foreign Missionary Society. And Hill, very aware of Mexican nationalism following the Mexican Revolution, she constantly advised the Methodist Women's Foreign Missionary Society that it was important to give names that had meaning to the Mexican families and students who attended these schools. So, for example, Hill wrote that originally, Hijas de Allende used to be called Colegio Ludlow in honor of a British mining executive who had come to the region in the mid-19th century. But Hill argued that Mexican students and their families preferred Hijas de Allende in homage to national independence heroes. Hill's school embraced Mexican political holidays, often inviting local politicians to the celebrations. And throughout La Cristiada, she worked closely with federal and state government to expand educational offerings to young women. And she was always quick. Again, she's a huge supporter of Calles, and she's always quick to point out how Colegio Hijas de Allende or Juárez school adhered to separation of church and state. She wrote a lot about how her school conducted itself, quote, completely in conformity with the government, end quote. In one example, she noted that her school had actually cemented one side of the classroom door that used to lead to an adjoining Methodist chapel, so that she could be in compliance with with regulations. And she wasn't alone. This is coming from most Methodist missionary organizations, teachers. One Methodist bishop reminded Protestants to celebrate national Mexican holidays by raising the flag and being patriotic. In a column in El Evangelista, Bishop Pasco reminded Methodist schools about federal holidays and when the flag should be raised fully, when it should be at half staff. Hill remarked in one of her articles for the Women's Foreign Missionary Society that the governor of Hidalgo participated in one of the flag presentation ceremonies at her school, Hijas de Allende, and the celebration took place in the city's main theater, quote, courteously given to us by the governor of the state, end quote. Later that night, she wrote how the governor actually borrowed the school's flag, right, the school's Mexican flag, because the governor needed it for giving the traditional Grito de Dolores at midnight. Hill wrote, needless to say, we were quite willing to lend it and have now inscribed on the band of our flag that it was so used by the governor, end quote. Hill portrayed her Methodist girls' school as the epitome of Mexican patriotism, so much so that they had just loaned out to the governor their own national flag for the traditional Grito de Dolores. So these examples, right, of Mexican Protestantism, patriotism in schools go hand in hand with the state's attempt to unite the nation under this new set of traditions and practices celebrating the revolution. Methodist schools like Hill's constantly portrayed themselves as bastions of Mexican nationalism and pride. In one letter back home to the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, Hill wrote how her students participated in another Mexican Independence Day holiday. She wrote, I wish you could have seen our girls, black bloomers, white stockings, keds, and white blouses with CHA and red as they marched in perfect time, carrying the new flag and with Colegio Hijas de Allende, Pachuca, Hidalgo, printed on it. They received tremendous applause, only equaled during the whole day by the applause they received for their gymnastics exercises. Everyone said theirs was the star performance, end quote. She also noted that the state band director, the inspectors of schools complimented the Methodist girls for their, quote, good singing and attention and wholeheartedness, end quote, during the presentation of the flag and the national anthem. Again, Hill over and over again, like many Protestants, foreign Protestants in Mexico, acknowledged the importance of making the school feel very much Mexican rather than some sort of North American imperialist project. She also constantly tapping into ideas about revolutionary nationalism that was pushing teachers to conduct literacy workshops in the countryside, rural areas. Hill was adamant that her students would do outreach to kids, to girls in rural areas, particularly in Native communities. So, for example, Hill quoted one of her students, a teenager who led a vacation Bible school, as stating, quote, I am proud of the Indian blood in my veins. When I leave school, I want to go out and work among the Indios, end quote. You can see here, Hill is just mimicking government publications, asking for assimilation into the nation state, ultimately requiring, this assimilation. I don't know. I'm actually curious. I don't know if that student actually said it. It was Hill was writing a letter to the Women's Foreign Missionary Society, but it fit in with this kind of narrative of showing that the school was pushing indigenous policy as well. So teachers, Methodist teachers, I'm going to move on and talk about a few Mexican Methodist teachers and activists. Methodist teachers played crucial roles in patriotic education, especially after the Methodist Church nationalized in the 30s. So, for example, Sisters Adelia and Juana Palacios taught and directed the Normal Methodista at various times. They also served in very high-ranking positions in CEP. Adelia Palacios founded the Normals, the Puebla Normals' first pro-patria club. Other teachers, for example, Methodist graduates, Carmen Basurto, Delfina Huerta, also played important roles in these ideas of revolutionary nationalism in the curriculum. For example, Delfina Huerta designed the national K-12 curriculum, the social studies curriculum. Her textbook, Mi Patria, I'm sure some of you have seen this. There's many editions from the 40s through the 50s. That textbook had many editions. Carmen Basurto, again, another graduate and a leader from the Puebla Normal. She wrote a poem that was published widely in Mexico about how teachers are sowing the seeds of literacy and patriotism. If you go visit the old Methodist Normal school today, it's not a teaching certification school anymore. It's kind of more of an elementary school. But if you go there, they still have hanging the poem and these pictures of Delfina Huerta and Carmen Basurto. All right, and so I will move on. So I'm going to talk about one more Mexican Methodist who went on to play an important role in women's rights activism. So Margarita Robles de Mendoza. She was a well-known journalist. She's an educator. She was a graduate of Puebla's Normal. She played a huge role in different organizations, heading organizations like the Inter-American Women's Commission, the Union of American Women, and she had lots of back and forth connections with the National Women's Party and the World Women's Party coming out of the U.S. She represented Mexico at several Pan-American conferences where suffrage and equal rights were constant themes. Margarita really hoped that the upcoming, when she founded her organization in the early 30s, the Frente Único Pro Derechos de la Mujer, she really hoped that Cárdenas's sexenio would be a time for women to get the vote, for suffrage. And throughout the 30s, she's working on suffrage in Mexico. She's also doing transnational work with elementary school kids, Mexican-American school kids in the US, in Texas and California. So she's constantly writing to Cárdenas about all this work she's doing, all this transnational organizing, how she's part of really good relations between the US and Mexico. She's constantly giving presentations about the promises of the revolution in Mexico being fulfilled. Yet despite all of this, right, despite all this advocacy, for Mexican students, Mexican-American kids, and for women's rights, she didn't have the right to vote in her own country, at the federal level. And again, as we all know, right, Cárdenas was at the cusp of working to get with the Congress to get women the right to vote in before the 1940 election. It does not work. Many of his constituents are really worried about the Catholic women. If they got the vote, they would vote for the opposition candidate. But still, Robles continued working closely with the Ministry of Public Education, with SEP, working as a high-ranking representative in Mexico's consulate in New York. She talked a lot about inequalities, not just with suffrage, but also within marriage. She caused quite the frenzy, or quite the scandal in the 30s by always registering in hotels in her own name, not using her husband's name. Similarly, we see that with other Methodist teachers constantly concerned about graduates of the Normal getting married too quickly, or worse, marrying a Catholic guy. So there was lots of workshops, lots of advice for girls to wait until they've started their career and have had a career before they marry, and don't get involved in a matrimonio mixto, a mixed marriage with a Catholic man. All right, so I'm going to now move over to sports. And so how does sports all fit into this? Robles was also a huge supporter of the YWCA and of sports programming in Methodist girls' schools. She wrote a lot about how YWCA activism for women was good, not just for having healthy bodies, but also having the confidence to participate in different types of political and social movements. So Methodist girls' schools, teachers, alumni, leadership supported the creation of YWCAs in Mexico. Adelia Palacios, who we just talked about before, she was the one that started the Pro Patria Club, the first Pro Patria Club in a Methodist school. She served on the National Executive Committee of the YWCA. We see within the Methodist girls' schools that I was talking about today, lots of emphasis on sports, salubrious living conditions. The Methodist girls' schools use the slogan very similar to the YWCA, YMCA slogan, but that they believed in the 3 M's of education, this idea of educación moral, educación mental, and educación muscular, and that this would make them strong, healthy women who are ready to defend the nation. They'd be these strong revolutionary citizens. So you see in the advertisements for most of, for Colegio Juarez and Hijas de Allende and all the Methodist girls' schools, lots of emphasis on sports as a way, to strengthen girls, give them more opportunities, and basketball was the big sport in Methodist girls' schools. Methodists first started playing basketball in the early 1900s when YMCA officials brought it into Puebla City in the early 1900s. So many of Clara Hill's students, they'd write back quite a bit about basketball tournaments. So for example, even after Hill left Mexico in 1931, she would get frequent correspondence about how the basketball teams were doing at the younger girls' schools and also at the Puebla Normal. So as an example, in one letter, 1933 letter, there was one graduate from Colegio Juarez who wrote to Hill about how it was hard, that she had just moved to Puebla City. She was going to be attending the teaching certification school, and she was feeling kind of lonely there and out of place. But one way she felt better was by attending the school's basketball tournaments. And she wrote to Hill about how she loved how all the girls in the bleachers would cheer, Arriba Metodista, hooray for the Methodists, when they won the tournament. And as Benita Lucio wrote, quote, when the games were over, everybody was hoarse. I can't describe the enthusiasm we all felt, end quote. And so constantly these activities of Methodist girls playing basketball, swimming, roller skating in the 30s and 40s. These were huge parts of the curriculum and activities that girls also did on vacations. The idea was to keep them occupied physically in activities that didn't include dancing or socializing, where they might meet a boyfriend, maybe a Catholic boyfriend. Ooh. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here. In conclusion, Methodist Episcopal Church of Mexico nationalized in the early 30s. Cardenas administration later revised the educational curriculum. Protestant schools began transitioning Mexican citizens to head the schools, not American missionaries. Methodist schools instilled confidence in girls through daily physical education, unity with other Protestant students across the nation, participation in team sports, membership in youth social organizations, teaching Bible classes. These Methodist school graduates went on to found suffrage movements, serve in SEP's leadership, and engage in transnational diplomacy. While women didn't get the right to vote in Mexico until 1953, careers in educational and missionary fields represented ways women could exercise revolutionary citizenship. And then I'll sum it up here by quoting Colegio Juarez's mission statement, which was empowering students to become good daughters, good teachers, and good Christian women who can contribute to the betterment of their gender, their church, and above all, their nation. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you. So we now are going to hear from Ben Fallaw, who is Director and Professor of Latin American Studies at Colby College, has a doctorate from the University of Chicago, and has taught in Colby since 2000. Research-wise, he's currently writing an ethnobiography of Mestizo Yucatecan Politico Bartolomé Garcia Correa, and his presentation today forms part of a bigger effort into anti-clericalism in Mexico, including the German fanaticism, science, and anti-clericalism in post-revolutionary state formation in Mexico, which is forthcoming in an anthology called Irreligion in Revolutionary Mexico, Ni Cruz ni Jesus, edited by Jürgen Buchner and David Dalton.
So thank you all, and my apologies again, and thanks for Kathleen for trying to get me out of, I don't know if it's purgatory or limbo where I was, but I think I had a snooze function that got out of hand because I logged in early and left. But anyway, and thank you, Matthew, for the invitation. I greatly appreciate it. The title of my paper today comes from a quote from Charles Bennett's study based on interviews with Protestant missionaries in Tabasco called Tinder in Tabasco, T-I-N, not T-E-N. You may be right, but I'm still going to have to attack, which is a quote from Tomas Garrido Canabal, the famous Comecura of the 1930s, supposedly said to, I believe, a Presbyterian missionary. And it refers to the fact that after a pretty close relationship, but with the post-revolutionary state, that mainline Protestants confronted a much more hostile state in the early 1930s during the Maximato, that I've called, as Matthew mentioned, irreligion is the term I've been using. And that's to say, not just against fanaticism, which usually was understood to mean Catholic forms and beliefs, but all metaphysical belief. And I won't bore you with some of the things I found in Garrido Cannabal's archive, but Matthew's heard this before. And there were dozens of letters for people trying to find Christian alternatives to Catholicism. And Garrido Cannabal was uncompromisingly no, absolutely not. And I'm trying to understand what this attitude meant for Protestants, and particularly mainline Protestants. And I in the first part of the paper, and I'm afraid I'll skip over it in the interest of time, I'm trying to look at what I've called Protestant intersectionality. That's to say, the way that people identified as Protestant because they went to Protestant colleges, because they associate with Protestants, and sometimes often turn up in the primary sources that we historians use, and this often gets sort of passed along subsequently, and we often don't know enough about the people identified as Protestant to really assess whether their support for the post-revolutionary state comes out of Protestantism, or what I would say, based on what I've seen in Yucatan, which is the state I know the best, people are exploring a number of alternatives to a provincial regional culture that's sort of marinated in Catholicism. And Protestantism seems to be one of the things they're drawn to. But there's a whole range of things, ranging from Spiritism, which pops up a lot in the archives. But Catholics generally ignore. They don't seem to have a beef with spiritualists, and might not even understand that they're there. To vegetarianism and a variety of alternative beliefs in between. And so I guess I'm not questioning at all Kathleen's work, and I think it's marvelous. But I think a lot of the people that are identified as Protestant in some of the states I'm looking at aren't at all. And so maybe we should have an epistemological discussion of that. And again, just going through my notes, I counted, I don't know how many Methodist bishops that reported at various times lurking in various states. And I honestly think that's something of an overcount, which I think speaks to this larger problem. So maybe we can come back to this question here or another time. But again, in particularly normal schools, I was really interested in what Kathleen said. These are often identified as captured by Protestants. And it's not clear at all if they're Protestant and to what extent the anti-clerical curriculum they're accused of teaching actually is coming from Protestantism. And Catholics tended to react to defanatization campaigns in the schools as Protestant evangelization in missionary work, whether it was or not. So in the next section, I was trying to look at the sort of big picture of Calles, Garrido, and Protestants during the Maximato, during the early 1930s. And again, I think Charles Bennett's study, which is based on interviews with Protestants, both U.S. born and Mexican, from Tabasco. And there is this kind of weak belief that Garrido Cannabal had kind of a wink and a nod understanding with Protestants, that he would throw a few in jail, he would expel some. But he was sort of, the words of one, creating a religious vacuum that Protestants would then swoop in and fill. And again, this, I think, and again, I respect his work very much. Robert Curley kind of sees this 1-2 punch where there's an offense against the church, and then the Protestants are going to sweep in, or some alternative, or maybe no religion at all. And again, I think this crops up in the historiography. And Protestants, there's certainly archival evidence that Protestants believe Calles was one of them. If we switch to Calles for a minute, but I'm not so sure. And I think compared to Carranza and Cardenas, Calles does not particularly have warm friendships with Protestants. He is accused both during his presidency and the Maximato of closing Protestant churches using the same laws that are being applied to the Catholics. And in fact, there's so many complaints to the U.S. State Department that they actually asked Calles in December 1931, and he denies any knowledge of it. And I think that's accurate, but I think people who understood themselves as acting on Calles' behalf for a variety of reasons, sometimes reacting to Catholic complaints that the ley de cultos needs to be applied evenly. That said, I don't want to spend too much time talking about Calles. I'm much more interested in middle level actors, and particularly what I've called lateral radicalization during the Maximato. And by this, I don't mean top down. I mean the influence that Gavito Cannibal is exercising over many, many people in the Mexican states. And, you know, I've gone through a lot of this correspondence, and a lot of people, some of it is political time serving and opportunism. But I think a lot of the people writing to Garrido Cannibal genuinely shared his belief that a defanatization campaign needed to be carried out energetically, and sin cuartel, right? I mean, without quarter and without exceptions. And so that's what I'm really interested in. And the sort of meat of my paper, and I want to talk mostly about this, has to do with two case studies. And they're in just happens to be I had more material on Chihuahua and Coahuila from previous research. So I focused on them. And I was looking at what happened in the early 1930s when state authorities promulgate these new laws that are very restrictive on culto externo, on the number of priests or ministers that can practice legally. And there are some instances of people who are Protestants or seem to be very sympathetic to Protestants are arguing that priests should be prosecuted under this and expelled. But I've also found cases where Protestant clergy are limited as well. And in particular, the case of Chihuahua, I think, is very interesting. And it turns out these are Methodist also. And the Chihuahuan governor during the late Maximato up to 38 is a man named General Rodrigo Quevedo, notorious for being responsible for the martyrdom of the last so-called Cristero priest in just after Ash Wednesday in 1937. And this chronologically is the last of the so-called Cristero saints. And Gerardo O'Rourke, the Irish Chihuahuan Catholic historian, excoriates Quevedo. And there's other sources too. He said there were only 5 Catholic priests allowed to minister, and there were just as many Methodists and 1 Pentecostal as well. But in fact, Protestants had their own concerns, and in November of 1934, the head of the Evangelical Methodist Church had his license to minister. The Methodist Church in Chihuahua had his license canceled, and he faced prosecution by the Quevedo's interim governor at the time, who had reportedly met with the delegation of, I believe it was Catholic women, maybe Damas Católicas. It's the Protestants aren't too clear who it is, but there was an indication of a clear quid pro quo that local elections were coming up, and the understanding would be that would be a crackdown on the Protestants, and in return, Catholic voters would be supportive of the official candidates. And again, I don't have a smoking gun, but I know these kind of deals, and Peter Reich has documented them as well. These kind of negotiations were common, even by officials on the revolutionary state side who are identified as anti-clerical. These kind of negotiations were commonplace. The Methodist minister under investigation, Ezequiel Vargas, and I'm assuming he's Mexican-born, although I can't be sure, he could be from Texas, claimed that the interim governor and the Catholics had in fact cut a deal, and that this had resulted in his unjust loss of his license, and he was now facing prosecution. Although I don't think he actually made it to court. Vargas must have been a tempting target for Catholics because he had translated in 1921 J.A. Phillips' anti-Catholic tract, which was circulating in Spanish. This would be a high-profile target, certainly. The Baptist, Methodist, and Evangelical mission, as well as the autonomous churches of Chihuahua, all feared closure of their churches and rallied to Vargas's defense and protested on his behalf. And their defense is very, I think, insightful. It says that the Pueblo Evangelico has always been distinguished by its selfless and patriotic behavior. It's always submitted to, and I should say, previous legislation affecting religion. And they write, not only did true Christianity, by that I mean Protestantism, prepare Mexicans for citizenship, but Protestants in the U.S. had complained to the United States government about the U.S. occupation of Veracruz and Pershing's expedition. And again, this kind of dovetails with what Kathleen was just saying about the Methodists elsewhere. And Vargas makes the same argument that Catholics did, that the leyes de culto were unconstitutional. And also argued, quote, that these laws are not anti-clerical, but openly anti-religious and anti-Christian. And again, very interesting evocation of patriotism. Why should Christians have to choose between God and the government when, quote, true Christian faith has never been incompatible with well-intentioned patriotism? Certainly something that Matthew's parishioners would agree with there. And it's typical in these cases, and this is always the case on the Maximato and Cardenas, Secretary of Gobernacion says this is a question for the states. And this is where the case ends, except for a couple months later, there's an interview with the U.S. State Department on the Texas side of the border with the former first bishop of the Southern Mexican Church in Mexico, John Nicanor Pasco Gomez, who is I won't say Anglo-Mexican, but British Mexican. His father was a Mexican missionary, Methodist missionary from Britain. And Pasco Gomez also complains about this anti-clerical legislation dating from the Maximato. He says it's different from everything since 1857 because it's reducing the number of Protestant ministers from 8 to 2. And he said, unlike the past, ministers who lose their license can't simply go to another state and kind of hide for a while. The presumption is that they might be being forced to leave Mexico entirely, although I'm not so sure about. That's just a guess. Pasco blamed new legislation on Catholic resistance to the arreglos. He said that Mexican exiles in San Antonio were preparing ammunition to support Escobar revolt. And again, there's this notion that the Catholics were going to rise up and just waiting for Escobar. And Al Smith's election in the United States in 1929, of course, the first Catholic candidate for president in 1928. So there's a real sensitivity to this sort of transnational supposed Catholic conspiracy time for 1929, which is, I think, really interesting. He blames Catholic resistance for provoking this new round of crackdowns on all the churches, but he also cites, quote, fanatic and materialistic socialism who believe that religion is an opiate of the people. And again, we can see this, I found this elsewhere, in which anti-religious, anti-materialist, and sometimes explicitly communism are rising. And again, certainly the communist influence is grossly exaggerated, but they're referring to Garrido Canabal's influence and this kind of extreme, not just anti-clerical, but anti-religious intent. By the way, Pasco points out that the Chihuahuan anti-clerical law, the new strict one, was drafted by 5 Catholic lawyers who were prominent supporters of the church. They were at the Supreme Court. The governor called them in and told them to write the law, and they did. So Pascoe points out the fact that Catholics themselves, he argues, were participating in the creation of these harsh laws. I found something similar in the neighboring state of Coahuila, where Methodists are seen as exceptionally literate, prosperous, and upstanding members of the upper class, the middle class or upper middle class. And the Methodists, as well as other mainline Protestants, were certainly very close to Carranza when he was governor and then president. In 1926, the Methodists in Coahuila openly endorsed Calle's, quote, great program, end quote. By the late 1920s, the rise of the Crom, which was anti-clerical, and the rhetoric of class warfare, no matter how sincere or insincere it was alarming Methodists in Coahuila. And by the time the Maximato begins, there's a real fear not just of irreligious materialism, but socialist education. And again, I've seen this in other states as well. That socialist education was seen as a threat rather than an ally. And in 1934, a Methodist minister had founded in Ciudad Allende the branch of the Unión Nacional de Padres y Familia, which was the covertly Catholic affiliated front for fighting socialist education and organizing truancy strikes. So here, not only are Protestants echoing the arguments that Catholics make, at least in this case, they're joining with the popular organizations that the clergy and lay leaders in the Catholic Church are mobilizing against federal schools. By the way, and Pascoe told Josephus Daniels that socialist education wasn't a problem, that the people that proposed it had high ideals and it was compatible with Christian principles. And again, that suggests there's a division among Protestants. And I think the dividing line seems to be this question of whether socialist education was advocating sexual education or sex ed. And I think that seems to be what was inflaming some Protestants, at least this minister in Ciudad Allende. To kind of wrap things up, Matthew, how am I doing on time? I don't want to go long at all because I've...
Maybe one more minute.
Okay. I want us to recognize the work that Matthew just shared with us today and that Jason has done, and looking at neither at the mainline Protestant groups, which I think are interesting, but newer Protestant groups. And I know Jason's first book is, I thought, really fascinating. Look at sort of Mexican versions of Pentecostalism and Mormonism. I think that the newer Protestant denominations, Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, these are the groups that are really expanding in the 1930s. And there's a Torres Vera book on Gallardismo, argues that it was these newer Protestant denominations that were organizing literacy campaigns in the name of Guerrero Cannibal in Tabasco. And there are some complaints by, for instance, the Presbyterians in Tabasco saying the Adventists are splitting his congregation, which I think speaks to a larger struggle. Last point, O'Rourke's count that there were 5 Methodists and 1 evangelical. O'Rourke missed 10. It's not classified, but newer Protestant denominations that were in Chihuahua as well, that the Catholic Church had no idea was there, and they generally had pretty good intel. So I'll stop there, and my apologies for the delay at the start of the panel.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that fascinating paper. So our next speaker is Madeleine Olsen, who is a PhD student in Latin American history here at UT Austin. She's writing a dissertation for the greater good, Catholics and Anti-Protestantism in Mexico, 1937 to 1962. It examines the relationship between nation building, anti-Protestant violence, and Catholic restoration in Mexico. And she is going to talk to us about the movement of the Crusade against the faith, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Matthew. So my paper's title is In Defense of Whose Faith? Sectarian Violence in Mexico City, 1947 to 1955. On March 21st, 1957, the anniversary of Benito Juarez's birthday, a contingent of evangelicals in Mexico City marched to the monument dedicated to the former president. Organized by the National Evangelical Defense Committee, or CONDEF, an interdenominational organization that protects and advocates for religious freedom in Mexico, the march drew thousands of evangelicals to Mexico City to participate. Once they reached the monument, Reverend Ramon Torres, the General Secretary for Christian Education and member of CONDEF, gave a speech demanding respect for the rights of the Protestant community. As it was a public march, religious overtones were kept to a minimum, and no mention was made of Christian symbolism, such as the word martyr. However, Torres did refer to historical events in which Christians were martyred, such as the persecution of Roman emperors, the massacre of St. Bartholomew of 1572, and present events, including the destruction of a Methodist temple in the town of San Andres Totonacapan and the expulsion of its congregants between 1941 and 1945. Torres wanted to demonstrate that the evangelical community was able to overcome these adversities thanks to superiority of their religion over Catholicism, as well as to denounce to public opinion that evangelicals were experiencing a true genocide. Given the null response of authorities and the impunity of their attackers towards this violence, CONDEF continued to organize yearly marches towards Juarez's monument to call for justice for their dead and wounded. Religious plurality was merely perceptible for the bulk of the Mexican population, since those who adhered to Protestantism at the beginning of the 20th century were no more than 30,000. This amount, however, was enough to annoy certain people who did not agree with the Protestant presence in the country, which led to episodes of violence in which evangelicals were murdered. Catholics worried that the newly imported evangelical religions threatened a way of life steeped in 400 years of tradition. As acts of intolerance against Protestant minorities intensified in Mexico from 1945 onward, the interest of Protestant leadership that represented the evangelical churches with greater presence in Mexico coincided. Evangelical communities far from the metropolises of Mexico City and Guadalajara needed formal representation or an organization to advocate for them. Thus, this paper examines the early activities of CONDEF from 1947 to 1956 to interrogate how and why it is necessary to create a new means of negotiation between the political and the religious. In 1947, Assemblies of God pastor David Rezga, along with other evangelical groups, formed CONDEF to foster interdenominational coexistence and cooperation. The organization was conceived as a strategic alliance that would help alleviate the evangelical cause in Mexico by employing and collaborate with pastors and lawyers. The organization sought to defend all religious freedom in Mexico, especially the evangelical faith, as well as to intervene in causes of aggression. CONDEF opened a public space for the civic, political participation of Mexican evangelicals. From 1950 onwards, the organization met with civil leaders to petition for their cause. They looked to the federal government, not local authorities, to enforce Article 24 of the Mexican 1917 Constitution, which guaranteed religious freedom. An examination of CONDEF also provides a window into how Protestants themselves viewed and responded to anti-Protestant violence. In the face of a church-state alliance that promoted the Catholic Restoration in the Mexican political sphere, Protestants had few ways in which they could compel authorities to prevent and punish religious violence. CONDEF worked to enforce constitutional law over local customary law by challenging religious freedom laws and holding accountable the national government to actively acknowledge and pursue justice of violence against religious minorities in Mexico. However, I argue that despite CONDEF working to enforce constitutional law by challenging the rules of religious freedom, they were able to gain protection from their persecutors not by appealing to constitutionally protected freedom of religion, but rather by capitalizing on tensions and weaknesses within the Catholic project itself. Faced with this escalating violence, pastors and evangelical leaders who had been active in any of the religious or the revolutionary factions and who identified with liberal and revolutionary legacy of church-state separation assumed a secular civic stance without ceasing to be believers in which, quote, their religious values and their relationship with the churches to which they belonged did not limit them in their political work, end quote. They became aware that the state did not satisfy or guarantee the resolution of acts of religious intolerance to their co-religionists because all of them continued to be referred to the corresponding authorities without direct intervention of the constitutional president. During the governments of Avila Camacho and Aleman Valdez, over 1,000 requests to open new evangelical churches did not receive a response from the Ministry of Interior. And Lindy Scott estimates that the Gobernacion tabled more than 1,000 requests for Protestant applications as part of an effort to placate the Catholic Church. When there was a violation of human rights, such as persecution or expulsion, CONDEF intervened with the government legally and politically. When authorities asked for proof, CONDEF presented witnesses who were expelled from the same community. However, quite frequently, this evidence was met with disdain, and government officials said that evangelicals who had been expelled could not testify because they were also affected by the case. Oftentimes, when authorities asked for victims to present witnesses from the very places where the expulsions took place, it was also impossible because if someone was seen as taking the side of the expelled, that person would too face expulsion. Legal proceedings took so long that the aggrieved gave up hope. They believed their time could be better used in solving their immediate needs for work, housing, and education for their children. With the passage of time, cases were given up or lost and forgotten. By 1948, David Ruesga was sending at least one complaint per week about attacks against Protestants to the Gobernacion, and he estimated that an average of one such attack occurred somewhere in the nation every day. A request that Ruesga made for direct and immediate intervention highlighted two major reasons for the disillusionment that Protestants were feeling about the federal government in the 1940s. Ruesga first brought to the Secretary's attention the many applications that were made by Protestant congregations for permission to open their churches for public worship services and asked the Secretary to grant those requests. These applications were critical for young, growing Protestant denominations, since all churches had to receive permission from the Gobernacion before any religious services could take place inside of them. If such permission was granted, the church building passed to the control of the federal government, since the Constitution specified that all church buildings belong to the nation. Protestants generally supported or at least tolerated these provisions of the Constitution because they served until 1940, primarily to weaken the Catholic Church. Whereas outright rejections would have given the Protestants recourse to the courts, mere inaction left them with few options. Most Protestant congregations thus faced a no-win situation. If they chose to open their churches anyways, they risked losing their property outright and had no recourse if their opponents damaged or destroyed them. But if they chose to continue honoring the law, they could not have any public worship services of any kind. Protestants found this predicament extremely frustrating. Having supported the revolution and the regime for 30 years, they were now treated as second-class citizens, whereas the until recently rebellious Catholics were treated with favor. Granting permissions to churches, argued Ruesga, was the unavoidable consequence of Article 24. For if Mexicans were free to believe as they wished to and practice their religious ceremonies as they wish, quote, for this guarantee to be effective, permission should be given for the opening of the church, end quote. What Ruesga called the tremendous acts of religious intolerance committed by clerical fanatics posed an equally grave problem. Local authorities often wanted to help, but he said, in spite of their desires to impart justice and to reestablish in the area of liberty of consciousness, they were unable to do so because they lacked power to establish respect for individual liberties. Ruesga believed that the best solution to this problem would be military intervention, but the Secretary of Defense had made it clear that only the Secretary of the Gobernacion could authorize the federal use of troops for such purposes. There are many serious cases of intolerance that we can mention, Ruesga continued, but for the moment we will confine ourselves to asking for decisive and quick intervention to give guarantees to 3 of our congregations. He called attention to 3 towns in the state of Mexico where Protestants had been attacked and killed and their churches and homes destroyed. The evangelicals from these places are refugees in the city of Mexico, for in addition to having lost their modest possessions, they have also been threatened with death if they returned, and they are in danger of losing their plots of land. For Protestants, this combination of the violence and government inactivity proved terrifying. Catholic opposition was bad enough, but government passivity intensified the problem, for it suggested to Protestants that in the absence of state intervention, violence would only escalate. In many cases of religious persecution, the response of seeking legal protection was simply inconsequential. Despite the existence of laws that guaranteed religious freedom, they were not enforced. The underlying assumption was that since the Mexican Constitution established clear human and religious rights, halting the unjust persecution was a matter of claiming that those rights were through the legal or justice system. That assumption, however, has been proven invalid case after case since those constitutional rights were not enforced. In the eyes of CONDEF, cases of anti-Protestant violence were not merely violations of the constitutionally protected freedom of religion, but rather a manifestation of a deep, more worrisome evil, religious fanaticism. At the time that Protestants were aware, and perhaps even shared, this wariness of the religious culture among the elite, they used it to their advantage. Whether Protestants, Presbyterian, Baptist, Congregationalists, or Pentecostalists wrote or spoke about Catholic persecution of their congregations, they almost always called their persecutors fanatics, and oftentimes made references to their relationship, whether real or imagined, with regional militaritarian overtones. Protestants frequently referred to priests who spearheaded anti-Protestant campaigns as the new Padre Martinez, referring to the Mexican Archbishop Luis Maria Martinez, who initiated the crusade in defense of the Catholic faith in 1945. While both state and ecclesiastical authorities had continued interest in promoting Catholic hegemony, their definition of Catholicism was a narrow one that excluded expressions of Catholic religiosity considered unorthodox or fanatical. Protestants understood this nuance and used it to their advantage. In their efforts to gain the rights and protections that they, as Mexican citizens, demanded and deserved, CONDEF capitalized on political, religious, and social divisions in the Catholic Church and in Mexican society. CONDEF created a template for those who experienced religious violence. In describing the fact of those who were victims, complainants expressed themselves as citizens who demanded the fulfillment of their constitutional rights, religious freedom, personal and family and property security. By using the liberal rhetoric of Juarez and the revolutionary legacy of freedom of consciousness, complainants argued that the authorities were neutral against these situations. They expressed the measures that Catholics, both Christian and Sinarquistas, used against them: death threats if they did not abandon their faith or the town, obligation to contribute financially to the festivities, construction of Catholic works, or subject to fines otherwise, aggressions in public spaces under the slogan of "Long live Christ the King" or "Long live the Virgin of Guadalupe," deprivation of water use, assaults on congregations in full worship, temple fires and evangelical homes that were dynamited, the women inside raped, robberies, imprisonment, and killings committed arbitrarily and with impunity. One effective method that CONDEF used was the development of tales of martyrdom to be used as propaganda. Inside their churches, evangelicals used the term martyr in telling stories of murdered members. Although the term holy in Protestantism can be explained only from the universal priesthood, a condition that allows any believer to consecrate himself as a religious leader, this figure could also serve to promote patterns of behavior worthy of imitation. Two pastors from the Pentecostal independent movement reported that between 1931 and 1948, several of the congregations were attacked and 3 of their members were killed. The first, who was martyred in front of his father, was in turn tied to a tree that he could see the torments that were applied to his children. Another example, Ramon Torres, he pulled together other testimonies of Mexican evangelical martyrs to form a biography of the preacher and seller of Bibles, Ricardo Garcia, who was murdered in 1952 in the mountains of the state of Hidalgo. On October 19, 1952, Garcia was preaching in a house in Hidalgo when a group of armed Catholics learned about it. According to the versions that Torres picked up, the attackers offered Ricardo to leave him alone if he denied his faith. To which he replied, "Deny Jesus Christ, my Savior and Lord?" They proceeded to shoot him point blank, but he survived long enough to lean back and pray until they finished him off with sharp weapons. According to other witnesses who saw the attack, every now and again, Ricardo's face shone with a pleasant smile, proof sure that he died with joy. Torres has collected several testimonies from people who witnessed the life of the preacher Ricardo, from his youth as a soldier in the Mexican army and his alcoholism until his conversion to Protestantism and his work as a minister. His interest in telling the story had its origin in the admiration that the author felt for Garcia, as Torres worked as a union leader before entering the Reformed Presbyterian Church and converting to Protestantism. This story bears certain resemblances to that of the martyrs of Catholicism, particularly with priests martyred during the Cruzada like Miguel Agustin Pro. According to testimonies, Pro consecrated himself to divinity before facing the wall of shooting, and his last words were, as we all know, "Long live Christ the King." Similarly, the life, work, and martyrdom of both characters served as an inspiration for those who opted the pastoral exercises in their respective confessions. Nevertheless, these are figures that distinguish themselves not only for their public use, but also by the model of the behavior that they represented. While the life of the Father Pro is portrayed from the virtues of his individual self, like his childhood until death, the trajectory of Garcia is marked by a sinful beginning, a life steeped in the vice of alcohol, that gives way to his conversion to Protestantism and his subsequent call to evangelize. Each martyr becomes a subject with whom others can identify and verify that it is possible to get rid of sinful behaviors, a central tenet of many Protestant doctrines. In 1956, Torres published a portrait of Garcia's life, ministry, and death in the Protestant newspaper La Probla. Condeff incorporated the term martyr, or whose stories have elements of martyrdom narrative, into their discursive representations of those who were persecuted. 25 years later, another Protestant minister and member of Condeff, Valente Hernandez, published a biography of the minister in Editorial Vida, an evangelical publishing house based in the United States, and one that continues to produce religious materials in Spanish today. Both Torres and Valente compared the story of Ricardo Garcia as a 20th century Apostle Paul, whose life should be an inspiration for believers, especially for the new generations. Thus, the evangelical martyrdom narrative served to create role models that inspired future preachers, despite in the midst of this persecution. Another effective method that Condeff used to implement both national and international pressure to gain justice for persecuted Christians was through press and mass media. In one of his many letters to state officials, Rezga mentioned that the Mexican people must know the truth and reality of what happens against evangelical churches. He claimed that newspapers are refractory to publish the point of view of evangelicals. Because of this, he urged the newspaper El Tiempo to devote a column about religion. Until the 1950s, Rezga, among others, used this platform to present facts and photographs related to, quote, the victims of religious fanaticism in different towns throughout Mexico, to record what they saw as the battle for human rights in Mexico. From 1944 to 1952, Tiempo, directed by Martin Luis Guzman, gave his column for this fact, and he demonstrated all of these incidences of religious fanaticism in towns across Mexico. Additionally, in 1949, Rezga published in El Tiempo a copy of the open letter directed to the President, the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of National Defense, and Attorney General, a response to the increasing violence against evangelical minorities in Mexico. He rightfully argued that both presidencies of Manuel Avila Camacho and Miguel Alemán did not consider such acts of intolerance as part of a national problem that required urgent resolution, nor even worth mentioning publicly. Interdenominational religious news services, such as the News Network International, also provided excellent worldwide communication to the international church of persecution and civil rights abuses. News Network International was well organized with international reporters located in specific areas of the world to provide communication linked to specific church publications across the world. Magazines and newspapers were among the hundreds of church publications in the United States alone that could multiply the effectiveness of such a communication link. Reports from religious news services also eventually reached major radio and television networks and national circulation of newspaper and news sources. In 1951, for instance, Condeff sent an open letter to UNESCO raising alert to the wave of religious intolerance that the Roman Catholic clergy had let loose upon Mexico, calling it a, quote, serious menace to the nation's prestige. However, the 1950s marked a distinct shift when top-level government officials began to openly denounce incidences. In 1953, 900 employees of the textile factory in Hidalgo destroyed an evangelical church located near the factory. CONDEF escalated to amplify the incident, demanding intervention to be brought to those involved to justice. Finally, President Ruiz Cortines acknowledged the wrongful nature of this and sent multiple letters to local officials to strictly and dutifully pursue a solution to the case. Additionally, the presidency of Adolfo López Mateos continued paying widespread attention to these cases. A combination of CONDEF's repeated efforts, as well as the fact that López Mateos' wife was Protestant, allowed for a more conciliatory approach to the religious question, as well as more federal government support in pursuing and intervening in cases of religious violence. While religious motivated lynchings continue even today, the numbers dropped drastically in the late 1950s, in a large part due to David Huesca and his early work with CONDEF. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine. Really, really interesting paper there. So our final speaker, and I welcome him in the name of all of the panelists, is Jason Dromedy, who we're very grateful to have as our commentator. Jason, please take it away.
I will see what I can do. I have to be in class in just a few minutes. So would all of you mind, can I just send comments to you? There's really about 3 minutes left here, and my TA is expecting me 5 minutes after that. So can I just send my comments to you? Let's do that. So you all can talk to each other and have a good conversation. And I will send those comments. We're just a little bit short on time, I think.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll look forward to receiving those, Jason. So thank you in advance for those. And I'm sure there'll be fascinating comments. Do any of the other panelists have a question for anyone else on the panel before we go?
I have just a quick question for Madeleine. I enjoyed your paper. I was curious, have you spoken to Abdias Perez in Mexico City? His father is one of the founders of CONIDEF, and there's an archive, a CONIDEF archive that's never open really, but you might be able to make connections with him and be able to see it. It's on, ironically, it's at Isabela La Católica, right around that station stop.
I've been there. I have not met him before.
Okay.
If you could send over his information, that would be fabulous.
Because he has
I
lots
spent
of
a couple
family.
days in the archive.
Oh, good, you got in, great. Because he has lots of family photos of his dad at some of those marches you mentioned. You might have some photographs to give you, so that'd be great.
Oh, awesome! Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I have one question for you, Kathleen, about the so the way that your Protestant stress this kind of nationalism, and maybe it's a question for all of you as well. But later, when the kind of nationalist pretext wears away, that the Roman Catholic Church can now say, well, we're good national citizens, well, we're obeying the law, then we're left with the secular part of the revolutionary deal. And that's the bit that Protestants don't seem to like any more than the Roman Catholics. So could you just speak to that in relation to your case, Kathleen? Because you stressed a lot that the importance of nationalism and the flag ceremony, lending the flag to the governor as well.
Yeah, and thank you. And actually, this can kind of respond back to some of Ben's comments in his paper. I think the Methodist schools, they were very careful to signal about nationalism and the flags and really show off that, especially when corresponding with their offices in the US. And there is lots of documentation of Methodist schools, particularly in Guanajuato during the height of the Cristiada, really writing back home saying, oh, it's not as bad as what you're being told by the Knights of Columbus or by the US press. This is, it's really the Catholics, the ones out of control. But yeah, it gets tricky. Most of the Methodists, the foreign missionaries that are involved in Methodist schools, they're out of Mexico or they're not working in these schools by 1931. So it is, in terms of like the end of the Maximato, they're not really, they're not running these schools anyhow. But I do think that they are being very careful to constantly stress that they're trying to be friendly with Catholics. And the Methodist schools, they don't advertise themselves as religious schools. They often talk about the wonderful stenography or mathematics or secretarial skills that you can learn at their schools. They'll talk about how their curriculum is completely, if you have a certificate from the Normal in Puebla, you can teach at any public school because it's the same, it's a double certification. So they'll talk about that a lot. And they'll talk a lot, even, YWCA, YMCA branches in the 30s are constantly being told, a good bit of your clientele is Catholic. How can you get more Catholics in? So I think that's going on. But the nationalism, and it gets tricky. Those of you that have gone on to write about or study the Summer Institute of Linguistics, they're going to pick it up during the Cardenas administration in terms of they're going to promote Mexican nationalism as well. And they'll be in that situation where they're constantly saying that they're good patriots, but at the same time, they're that most of the education, some of the educational reform going on in Mexico in the 30s is a complete anathema to what they believe, but they're going to, get lucrative book publishing deals with SEP, maybe by not until like the 40s and 50s, but still. So I hear what Ben is saying, but they're careful how they do it, I think.
So, can you hear me? Is it on? Madeleine, I was going to ask you a question. A lot of these violence happens in Estado de Mexico, and there's a strong priista group that still is there. So, were they tacitly in alliance with the Catholics in Estado de Mexico, and they didn't want to rile them by getting involved in policing this kind of violence?
I think definitely. I think they wanted to kind of protect the status quo of what was going on. So they didn't want to go either one way or the other. There was a lot of documentary evidence that they got all these kind of witness reports and newspaper reports and film and photographs of these incidences occurring. And instead of saying, no, we're going to do nothing, no, we're going to prosecute them, they just did nothing in order to kind of protect the status quo and not say that they were siding with one way or the other.
It's also the Archdiocese of Mexico, the Estado de Mexico, so I wonder about that too, since that's Mayor Martinez's territory, and it's where the cause is being celebrated, especially.
Yeah, I think both the proximity and also just kind of the alliance between the Catholic Church because of this proximity and also just because of how staunchly Catholic this region was, allowed for these complainants to be tabled, to be forgotten, to be lost, anything else, instead of just outrightly denied or persecuted or pursued.
Yeah. One for Ben, actually. I was wondering whether it's possible to look for like applications of Article 33 in Relaciones Exteriores, whether that would give you an insight into the kind of climate shift that you're describing in the 1930s. So we've had kind of years of Protestant affinity with the revolution, and now all of a sudden much more fussy about foreign religious personnel in Mexico and metaphysical crisis in general. So I just wonder whether there's like an uptick in expulsions of Protestant ministers, or whether that's ever a factor. Because if it would be a factor, it would seem to be now at this point during the Maximato with the changes that you're describing. Ben appears to be frozen. The winter's already started in Maine by the looks of it. Okay. Well, I think. Since we're now down to 3, we might end the proceedings. So again, thank you, Kathleen and Madeleine, for your papers, and to our to Ben and Jason in absentia, but in lieu of his comments by email. And thank you to those who've been watching this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing.
Thank you.